Hello, and welcome to Cosmic Dream Sanctuary. This is a sacred reading of the work on the heavenly hierarchy by Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. So how this works is that I will introduce the text, I will read the text, and then I will reflect on the text. You are invited to engage with this material in a way of meditation as opposed to strictly scholarly work or anything like that. So there won't be a test at the end. You don't have to understand all the concepts. You don't even have to pay attention to all of this, although the invitation is to come back to the experience of the text unfolding. And you can do that sort of like you might tune into the sensation of your breath as it flows in and out of your body in meditation. So just like you get distracted in meditation and you bring your attention back to the breath, in this experience you are invited to have whatever experience you have, but whenever you think about it, establish the habit of coming back to the contemplation of the text as it unfolds. So I am going to introduce this text by reading a bit from the Wikipedia description. So Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite was a Greek author of the late 15th century, and he was a Christian theologian and a Neo-platonic philosopher. And I'll introduce these terms a little bit. The author here calls himself Dionysius and portrays himself as Dionysius the Areopagite, who was the Athenian convert of Paul the Apostle in the book of Acts. So this attribution to the earliest decades of Christianity resulted in this work being given great authority in subsequent theological writings, both in the East and the West. So the Dionysian writings and their mystical teachings were universally accepted throughout the East among both the Chalcidians and non-Chalcidians, and also had a strong impact on the medieval Western mysticism, most notably Meister Eckhart. So we've talked a little bit about Meister Eckhart in the Cosmic Dream Sanctuary live series on Sunday mornings, and I believe that was on the one where we contemplated the slogan, rest in the nature of the Alaya. So if you're interested in Meister Eckhart, we talk about him there and introduce a prayer. So why am I talking about this, and why am I offering this work here and now? I am doing so primarily because I was engaged in learning about the angels, which I like to do, and there was a lot of zing to the name Pseudo-Dionysius, and I had studied him again in context of Meister Eckhart and some of my Platonic studies and things like that. You kind of hear this where Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite is like such a romantic name. What is Pseudo-Dionysius? Why is this, is this a god? Is this not? Who is this? So there are all these sorts of questions, and I was really directed to talk or bring this forward. I haven't actually read the work. I scanned it. So I'm going to introduce it by way of how this is relevant, that sort of thing, as I think. And then we'll read the text, and then I'll reflect a little bit about it afterward. I wanted to talk a bit about Neo-platonism and the sense of Platonic versus Aristotle. So these are kind of crude ways of thinking about things, but when we look to Platonism or Neo-platonism, there's an understanding of mysticism, in mysticism as a way of knowledge. So this really comes to the sense, comes up and out of the work of Plato. You might know of Plato as the author of the dialogues about Socrates. This is literally the foundation of Western philosophy, more or less. So Plato and Socrates had these sort of mystical experiences, and they have this esoteric and exoteric meaning. Secret and public knowledge, right? So some of the public knowledge has been presented in the dialogues, and some of the topics that Plato talks about, like being in the cave. There's this world of form that's more true than this world of illusion that we're living in, and that we're invited to move from this world of illusion into this world of reality through contemplation of things like death. things like forms, things like geometry, will bring us up and into that deeper world of truth. So in those experiences, in this way, there is a whole lot of esoteric knowledge. One way that it's really important to talk about, because this dialogue between the esoteric and the exoteric, the Platonic and the Aristotelian, is characteristic of Western thought and Western philosophy, in that we are really actually experiencing amnesia as a culture as to the nature of this dialogue. So this isn't a conflict. This is simply, these are two different poles of our ways of knowing. And this really comes up out of the dialogue when we look at Plato and we look at the Greek words logos and mythos. This is the foundation of logic and mythology. But even when we look to, say, the Phaedrus by Plato, where he's talking about Socrates' death, Socrates, he goes through this whole sort of logical, philosophic reasoning about why he's not afraid to die. And then he says, we're at the end of our logical capacities. Let's talk about something else. And this is, he stops using the word logos and he starts using the word mythos, meaning a truth that is spoken, or a communication that is spoken. There's no actual sense that mythology is made up. It's just talking about the ways of knowledge that are engaged when we talk about these different things. So he stops doing this rational, logical kind of dialectic, and he starts talking about his experiences at the Eleusinian Mysteries, which you might even imagine as sort of mystical, psychedelic experiences. He starts talking about relating to an intermediary being called the daemon. So Socrates here is talking about a world of experience that is beyond this physical world, that he truly had a connection and experience with, and he's trying his best to relate it to people, but he cannot do so in a logical way, because logic in this context doesn't work. It breaks down, and he has to use mythos or mythology to communicate these truths. And in terms of mythos, it's a sense of both testimony and an invitation to experience. It's a little bit of a long introduction to this concept of Neo-platonism. So after the time of Plato, Plato establishes the academy and he teaches Aristotle. Aristotle has his own academy after a while and gets really Aristotelian, meaning he starts writing down a lot of lists. He starts doing science. He starts making all of this knowledge that was perhaps mystical into exoteric understanding. And so here we get a lot of the sort of the churchmen, the people who write dogma, they look to Aristotle and have looked to Aristotle. But then throughout the history of Western philosophy, there's been these injections of mythology and experience into this that then our Aristotelian and intellectual and logical mind can then make lists out of and things like that. And so I'm talking about this because the Neoplatonic is one of the ways that actual experience is injected into Western discourse. And so we see ourselves here in this moment at the 21st century where there's a lack of sophistication in terms of our understanding of the material universe and about how we can relate scientifically or relate to our collective intelligence, our collective knowledge about our world together. So we're now in this sort of Aristotelian nightmare world, right? We're only scientists. We're only working with lists and stuff. We haven't necessarily honored the mythos, the spoken word, the story in a way that is holistic. And so that's why I'm talking about this, is so that we have a sense of understanding about mythos and logos, and to know that just like our Western science that has brought us to the moon and split the atoms has a long history in Western culture, so too there's a long history in Western culture of mystical experiences informing that exoteric exploration of the universe. So That's one of the contexts I'm talking and looking to these experiences about. The second thing I want to talk about, and this may or may not actually be related, is the sense of the Pseudo-Dionysius naming himself after Dionysus, who in turn is named after Dionysus. Dionysus is the Greek god of partying, of wine, of this sort of wild, chaotic energy of natural kind of this fermentation. He's also associated with dismemberment experiences and rememberment experiences. So Christ, in one way, the mythology of the Christ being crucified is a Dionysian activity. The same thing with Osiris being ripped apart. That is a Dionysian experience. In contrast, Nietzsche, the philosopher, talked about this polarity between Apollo and Dionysus. So this is you might even understand this in terms of, are you more Apollonian or Dionysian? Apollonian is very much in the head. It's very much the light of consciousness sort of activity. So again, that's sort of at play. The sense of naming is interesting, and I wanted to talk about this because there is a feeling of continuation, even in this description of Pseudo-Dionysius from Dionysius the Areopagian, Areopagite. That's a really funny word to say. There's a communication between the two. And so as you see, this guy named himself Dionysus after Dionysus after Dionysus, and he got a lot of credence just because of that naming. And he's a religious figure, he's writing. And so this starts to feel a little bit like the Tibetan Tulkus. So you might be familiar with Tibetan Buddhism. You might be familiar with the figure, the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama means something like the greatest monk, or the greatest, monk, basically. And so these lamas, they reincarnate over time, and so they can choose their path of reincarnation. These streams of souls that incarnate as lamas and are recognized as Rinpoches. So if you hear the word Rinpoche, that means precious jewel. That means that being has been recognized to be an intentional incarnation of a stream of soul that has been incarnating and teaching. So the Dalai Lama is the great Lama or something like that. And has had 14 incarnations previously and has been recognized. So in the West, we don't necessarily have this experience of Tulku. The Tulku is just the word for this sense of intentional incarnation. But this really feels intuitively, got the intuitive prompt to talk about Tulku in this context, primarily because Dionysus, anyone who has a name named after a god, right, or a famous person, has some sort of resonance with that. So we're already resonating with Dionysus, as perhaps there's some information coming in that's Dionysian in nature through Dionysian, the Areopagite, and then also Pseudo-Dionysius. In this case, it's really interesting because the credibility or the credence given to the work of the Pseudo-Dionysius came on the experience of Dionysus. And I often sort of yearn for a deeper experience of Tulku in the West, and also an understanding of this sort of transmigration of souls and intentional incarnation. I wish we had greater facilities to recognize these souls and to help foster it. So just understanding, right, there are many ways of incarnation and many ways of intentional incarnation. That our ways of incarnating may or may not look exactly like the Tibetan Buddhists, but there is a sense that beings can be here and present that have a deep connection to their soul lineages. And we actually see this coming in through the starseed mythology, through the quantum healing practice, to help connect people with their deeper truths and deeper connections and things like that. So here, this is simply just opening a space of contemplation of the sense of intentional incarnation. I'm curious what will come in understanding this kind of connection in this context. The why heavenly hierarchy is why am I talking about this? Why am I looking into this in particular? The sense to moving, and I think this is the last bit of reflection I'll do before reading the text, is is that we need to know what's out there, right? Like we need to know what's out there, and there is a feeling of intelligence and order to the psychic, psycho-spiritual, or imaginal worlds, right? So in my work with the Book of Galactic Light and the Enochian rituals, there were 30 aethers, which are understood to be layers of consciousness. This is very similar to like Swedenborg's journey through the heavens. This is very similar to Robert Monroe's Focus 1 to whatever, 20. This is these different layers and gradations of consciousness. So here we have a heavenly hierarchy where he's talking about angels and beings. It is important, I think, to open up to the testimony of people who have gone before, because really it's helpful. It's really helpful to understand. They may actually have had experiences that we don't have to like reinvent the wheel. One of the things that angels tell me is to work with them in the most particular way possible, most specific way possible. So not just, oh, angels help me, but really get specific in terms of the words you're using, in terms of the invocations you're using, in terms of who you're actually relating with. You can really call forth a lot of different intelligences, and they'll actually guide you. I mean, you don't need to you don't need to know all the names of angels or whatever in order to relate with them. They'll meet you where you're at and start teaching you. One of the ways they teach you is through your own study and practice, and this is part of that. So thank you for being here. I invite you to just start tuning into your breath. Start tuning into the knowledge that you can just be here in whatever way is meaningful to you. And without further ado, this is the Heavenly Hierarchy by Pseudo-Dionysius. And Chapter 1. To my fellow presbyter Timothy, Dionysius the presbyter, that every divine illumination, whilst going forth lovingly to the objects of its forethought under various forms, remains simplex. Nor is this all. It also unifies the thing illuminated. Section 1. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and cometh down from the Father of lights. Further also, every procession of illuminating light proceeding from the Father, whilst visiting us as a gift of goodness, restores us again gradually as a unifying power, and turns us to the oneness of our conducting Father, to a deifying simplicity. For all things are from him and to him, as said the sacred word. Section 2. Invoking then Jesus, the paternal light, the real, the true, which lighteth every man coming into the world, through whom we have access to the Father, source of light, let us aspire, as far as is attainable, to the illuminations handed down by our fathers in the most sacred oracles, and let us gaze, as we may, upon the hierarchy of the heavenly minds manifested by them symbolically for our instruction. When we have received with immaterial and unflinching mental eyes the gift of light, primal and superprimal, of the supremely divine Father, which manifests to us the most blessed hierarchies of the angels and types and symbols, let us then from it be elevated to its simple splendor, for it never loses its own uniqueness, inwardness, but multiplied and going forth as become its goodness, for an elevating and unifying blending of the objects of its care remains firmly and solitarily centered within itself in its unmoved sameness, and raises according to their capacity those who lawfully aspire to it, and make them one after the example of its own unifying oneness. For it is not possible that the supremely divine ray should otherwise illuminate us, except so far as it is enveloped for the purpose of instruction in variegated sacred veils and arranged naturally and appropriately for such as we are by paternal forethought. Section 3. Wherefore the divine institution of sacred rites, having deemed it worthy of the supramundane imitation of the heavenly hierarchies, and having depicted the aforesaid immaterial hierarchies in material figures and bodily compositions in order that we might be born, as far as our capacity permits, from the most sacred pictures to the instructions and similitudes without symbol and without type, transmitted to us our most holy hierarchy. For it is not possible for a mind to be raised to that immaterial representation and contemplation of the heavenly hierarchies without using the material guidance suitable to itself, accounting the visible beauties and reflections of the invisible comeliness and the sweet odors of the senses as emblems of the spiritual distribution, and the material lights as a likeness of the gift of the immaterial enlightenment, and the detailed sacred instruction of the feast of contemplation within the mind, and the ranks of the orders here of the harmonious regulated habit with regard to divine things, and the reception of the most divine Eucharist, of partaking of Jesus, and whatever other things were transmitted to heavenly beings supermundanely, but to us symbolically. For the sake, then, of this proportionate deification, the philanthropic source of sacred mysteries, by manifesting the heavenly hierarchies to us, constituting our hierarchy as fellow ministers with them, through our imitation of their godlike priestliness, so far as in us lies, described under sensible likeness, the supercelestial minds, in the inspired composition of the oracles, in order that it might lead us through the sensible to the intelligible, and from inspired symbol to the simple sublimities of the heavenly hierarchies. Chapter 2. That divine and heavenly things are appropriately revealed, even through dissimilar symbols. Section 1. It is necessary then, as I think, first to set forth what we think is the purpose of every hierarchy, and what benefit each one confers upon its followers, and next to celebrate the heavenly hierarchies according to their revelation in the oracles. Then, following these oracles, to say in what sacred forms the holy writing of the oracles depict the celestial orders, and to what sort of simplicity we must be carried through the representations, in order that we may also not, like the vulgar, irreverently think that the heavenly and godlike minds are certain many-footed, many-faced creatures, or molded to the brutishness of oxen, or the savage form of lions, and fashioned like the hooked beaks of eagles, or the feathery down of birds, and should imagine that there are certain wheels of fire above the heaven, or material thrones upon which the Godhead may recline, or certain many-colored horses, and spear-bearing leaders of the host, and whatever else was transmitted by the oracles to us under the multifarious symbols of sacred imagery. And indeed, the word of God artlessly makes use of poetic representation of sacred things, respecting the shapeless minds out of regard to our intelligence, so to speak, consulting a mode of education proper and natural to it, and molding the inspired writing for it. Section 2. But if anyone think well to accept the sacred compositions as of things simple and unknown in their own nature and beyond our contemplation, but thinks the imagery of the holy minds and the oracles is incongruous, and that all this is, so to speak, a rude scenic representation of the angelic names, and further says that the theologians ought, when they have come to the bodily representation of creatures altogether without body, to represent and display them by appropriate and, as far as possible, cognate figures taken, at any rate, from our most honored and immaterial and exalted beings, and ought not to clothe the heavenly and godlike simple essences with the many forms of the lowest creatures to be found on earth, for the one would perhaps be more adapted to our instruction and would not degrade the celestial explanations to incongruous dissimilitudes, but the other both does violence without authority to the divine powers, and likewise leads astray our minds through dwelling upon these irrelevant descriptions. And perhaps He will also think that the super-heavenly places are filled with certain herds of lions and troops of horses and bellowing songs of praise, and flocks of birds and other living creatures, and material and less honorable things, and whatever else the similitudes of the oracles, in every respect dissimilar, describe for a so-called explanation, but which verge toward the absurd and perniculous and impassioned. Now, in my opinion, the investigation of the truth demonstrates the most sacred wisdom of the oracles in the descriptions of the heavenly minds, taking forethought, as that wisdom does wholly for each, so as neither, as one may say, to do violence to the divine powers, nor at the same time to enthrall us in the groveling passion of the debased imagery. For any one might say that the cause why forms are naturally attributed to the formless, and shapes to the shapeless, is not alone our capacity, which is unable immediately to elevate itself to the intelligible contemplations, and that it needs appropriate and cognate instructions which present images suitable to us of the formless and supernatural objects of contemplation. But further, that it is most agreeable to the revealing oracles to conceal through mystical and sacred enigmas, and to keep the holy and secret truth respecting the supramundane minds inaccessible to the multitude. For it is not everyone that is holy, nor, as the oracles affirm, does knowledge belong to all. Section 3. But if any one should blame the descriptions as being incongruous by saying that it is shameful to attribute shapes so repugnant to the godlike and most holy orders, it is enough to reply that the method of divine revelation is twofold. One, indeed, as is natural, proceeding through likeness that are similar and of a sacred character, but the other through dissimilar forms, fashioning them into an entire unlikeness and incongruity. No doubt the mystical traditions of the revealing oracles sometimes extol the august blessedness of the super-essential Godhead as word and mind and essence, manifesting its God-becoming expression and wisdom, both as really being origin and true cause of the origin of things being, and they describe it as light and call it life. While such sacred descriptions are more reverent and seem in certain ways to be superior to the material images, they yet, even thus, in reality fall short of the supremely divine similitude, for it is above every essence and life. No light, indeed, expresses its character, and every description in mind incomparably falls short of its similitude. But at other times, its praises are super mundanely sung by the oracles themselves through dissimilar revelations, when they affirm that it is invisible and infinite and incomprehensible, and when there is signified not what it is, but what it is not. For this, as I think, is more appropriate to it, since, as the secret and sacerdotal tradition taught, we rightly describe its non-relationship to things created, but we do not know its super-essential and inconceivable and unutterable indefinability. If then the negotiations respecting things divine are true, but the affirmations are inharmonious, the revelation as regards things invisible through dissimilar representations is more appropriate to the hiddenness of things unutterable. Thus the sacred descriptions of the oracles honor and do not expose to shame the heavenly orders, when they make them known by dissimilar pictorial forms and demonstrate through these their supermundane superiority over all material things. And I do not suppose that any sensible man will gainsay that the incongruous elevate our mind more than the similitudes, for there is a likelihood, with regard to the more sublime representations of heavenly things, that we should be led astray, so as to think that the heavenly beings are certain creatures with the appearance of gold, and certain men with the appearance of light, and glittering like lightning, handsome, clothed in bright shining raiment, shedding forth innocuous flame, and so with regard to all the other shapes and appropriate forms with which the Word of God has depicted the heavenly minds, in order that men may not suffer from this, by thinking that they are nothing more exalted than their beautified appearance. The elevating wisdom of the pious theologians reverently conducts to the incongruous dissimilitudes, not permitting our earthly part to rest fixed in the base image, but urging the upward tendency of the soul and goading it by the unseemliness of the phrases to see that it belongs neither to lawful nor seeming truth, even for the most earthly conceptions, that the most heavenly and divine visions are actually like things so base. Further, also, this must particularly be borne in mind that not even one of the things existing is altogether deprived of participation in the beautiful, since, as is evident and the truth of the oracles affirm, all things are very beautiful. Section 4. It is then possible to frame in one's mind good contemplations from everything, and to depict from things material the aforesaid dissimilar similitudes, both for the intelligible and the intelligent, since the intelligent hold in a different fashion things which are attributed to things sensible differently. For instance, appetite in the irrational creatures takes its rise in the passions, and from their movements, which take the form of appetite, is full of all kinds of unreasonableness. But with regard to the intelligent, we must think of the appetite in another fashion, as denoting, according to my judgment, their manly styles and their determined persistence in their godlike and unchangeable steadfastness. In like manner, we say, with regard to the irrational creatures, that lust is a certain uncircumspect and earthly passionate attachment, arising incontinently from the innate movement or intimacy in things subject to change, and the irrational supremacy of the bodily desire, which drives the whole organism towards the object of sensual inclination. But when we attribute lust to spiritual beings by clothing them with dissimilar similitudes, we must think that it is a divine love of the immaterial, above expression and thought, in the inflexible and determined longing for the supernally pure and passionless contemplation, and for the really perpetual and intelligible fellowship in that pure and most exalted splendor, and in the abiding and beautifying comeliness. And incontinence we may take for the persistence and inflexibility which nothing can repulse, on account of the pure and changeless love of the divine beauty, for the whole tendency toward the really desired. But with regard to the irrational living beings, or soulless matter, we appropriately call their irrationality and want of sensible perceptions the deprivation of reason and sensible perception. And with regard to the immaterial and intelligent beings, we reverently acknowledge their superiority as supramundane beings over our discursive and bodily reason, and the material perception of the senses which is alien to the incorporeal minds. It is then permissible to depict forms which are not discordant to the celestial beings, even from portions of matter which are the least honorable, since even it, having had its beginning from the essentially beautiful, has throughout the whole range of matter some echoes of the intellectual comeliness, and it is possible through these to be led to the immaterial archetypes, things most similar being taken, as has been said, dissimilarly, and the identities being denned, not in the same way, but harmoniously and appropriately as regards the intellectual and sensible beings. Section 5. We shall find the mystic theologians enfolding these things not only around the illustrations of the heavenly orders, but also sometimes around the supremely divine revelations themselves. At one time, indeed, they extol it under exalted imagery as sun of righteousness, as morning star rising divinely in the mind, and as light illuming without veil and for contemplation, and at other times through things in our minds as fire, shedding its innocuous light, as water furnishing a fullness of life, and to speak symbolically, flowing into a belly and bubbling forth rivers flowing irresistibly, and at other times from things most remote as sweet-smelling ointment, as head cornerstone. But they also clothe it in the form of wild beasts, and attach to it identity with a lion, a panther, and that it shall be a leopard and a rushing bear. But I will also add that which seems to be more dishonorable than all and the most incongruous, viz., that distinguished theologians have shown it to us as representing itself under the form of a worm. Thus do all the godly wise and the interpreters of the secret inspiration separate the Holy of Holies from the uninitiated and the unholy to keep them undefined, and prefer the dissimilar descriptions of holy things, so that divine things should neither be easily reached by the profane, nor those who diligently contemplate the divine imagery rest in the types as though they were true. And so divine things should be honored by the negotiations and by comparison with lower things, which are diverse from their proper resemblance. There is then nothing absurd if they depict even the heavenly beings under incongruous dissimilar similitudes for causes aforesaid. For probably not even we should have come to an investigation from not seeing our way, not to say to mystic meaning through an accurate inquiry into divine things, unless the deformity of the descriptions representing the angels had shocked us, not permitting our mind to linger in the discordant representation, but rousing us utterly to reject the earthly proclivities and accustoming us to elevate ourselves through things that are seen to their supramundane mystical meanings. Let these things suffice to have been said on account of the material and incongruous description of the holy angels and the holy oracles. And next, it is necessary to define what we think the hierarchy is in itself, and what benefit those who possess a hierarchy derive from the same. But let Christ lead the discourse, if it be lawful for me to say, He who is mine, the inspiration of all hierarchical revelation, and thou, my son, after the pious rule of our hierarchical tradition, do thou religiously listen to things religiously uttered, becoming inspired through instruction in inspired things. And when thou hast unfolded the divine things in the secret recesses of thy mind, guard them closely from the profane multitude as being uniform, for it is not lawful, as the oracles say, to cast to swine the unsullied and bright and beautifying comeliness of the intelligible pearls. Chapter 3. What is hierarchy and what is the use of hierarchy? Section 1. Hierarchy is, in my judgment, a sacred order and science in operation, assimilated as far as attainable to the likeness of God, and conducted to the illuminations granted to it from God, according to capacity, with a view to the divine imitation. Now the God-becoming beauty, as simple, as good, as source of initiation, is altogether free from any dissimilarity, and imparts its own proper light to each according to their fitness, perfects in most divine initiation, as becomes the undeviating molding of those who are being initiated harmoniously to itself. Section 2. The purpose, then, of hierarchy is the assimilation and union, as far as attainable, with God, having him leader of all religious science and operation, by looking unflinchingly to his most divine comeliness, and copying, as far as possible, by perfecting its own followers as divine images, mirrors, most luminous and without flaw, receptive of the primal light and supremely divine ray, and devoutly filled with the entrusted radiance, and again spreading this radiance ungrudgingly to those after it in accordance with the supremely divine regulations. For it is not lawful for the mystic rites of sacred things or for things religiously done to practice anything whatever beyond the sacred regulation of their own proper function, nor even must they attempt otherwise if they desire to attain its deifying splendor and to look at it religiously, and are molded after the example of each of the holy minds. He, then, who mentions hierarchy denotes a certain altogether holy order, an image of the supremely divine freshness, ministering the mysteries of its own illumination in hierarchical ranks and sciences, and assimilated to its own proper head as far as lawful. For each of those who have been called into the hierarchy find their perfection in being carried to the divine imitation in their own proper degree, and what is more divine than all in becoming a fellow worker with God, as the oracles say, and in showing the divine energy in himself manifested as far as possible. For it is an hierarchical regulation that some are purified and that others purify, that some are enlightened and others enlightened, that some are perfected and others perfect. The divine imitation will fit each in this manner. The divine blessedness, to speak after the manner of men, is indeed unstained by any dissimilarity, and is full of invisible light, perfect in needing no perfection, cleansing, illuminating, and perfecting, yea, rather a holy perfection and illumination and perfection, above purification, above light, preeminently perfect, self-perfect source and cause of every hierarchy, and elevated preeminently above every holy thing. Section 3. It is necessary then, as I think, that those who are being purified should be entirely perfected, without stain, and be freed from all dissimilar confusion, that those who are being illuminated should be filled with the divine light, conducted to the habit and faculty of contemplation in all purity of mind, that those who are being initiated should be separated from the imperfect, and become recipients of that perfecting science of the sacred things contemplated. Further, that those who purify should impart from their own abundance of purity their own proper holiness, that those who illuminate, as being more luminous intelligences, whose function it is to receive and to impart light, and who are joyfully filled with holy gladness, that these should overflow in proportion to their own overflowing light toward those who are worthy of enlightenment, and that those who make perfect, as being skilled in the impartation of perfection, should perfect those being perfected through the holy instruction in the science of the holy things contemplated. Thus each rank of the hierarchical order is led in its own degree to the divine cooperation by performing through grace and God-given power those things which are naturally and supernaturally in the Godhead, and accomplished by it superessentially and manifested hierarchically for the attainable imitation of the God-loving minds. Chapter 4. What is meant by the appellation angels? Section 1. Now that the hierarchy itself has been, in my judgment, sufficiently defined, we must next extol the angelic hierarchy, and we must contemplate with supramundane eyes its sacred formation depicted in the oracles, in order that we may be borne aloft to their divine resplendent simplicity through the mystical representations, and may extol the source of all hierarchical science with God-becoming reverence and with thanksgiving. First of all, however, let this truth be spoken, that it was through goodness that the supra-essential Godhead, having fixed all the essences of things being, brought them into being. For this is the peculiar characteristic of the cause of all things, and of goodness surpassing all, to call things being to participation of itself, as each order of things being was determined from its own analogy. For all things being share in a providence which bubbles forth from the superessential deity, cause of all things, for they would not be unless they had participated in the essence and origin of things being. All things then without life participate in it by their being, for the being of all things is the deity above being. Things living participate in its life-giving power above all life. Things rational and intellectual participate in its self-perfect and preeminently perfect wisdom above all reason and mind. It is evident then that all those beings are around it which have participated in it in many forms. Section 2. The holy orders, then, of the heavenly beings share in that supremely divine participation in a higher degree than things which merely exist, and or which lead an irrational life, or which are rational like ourselves. For by molding themselves intelligibly to the divine imitation, and looking supermundanely to the supreme divine likeness, and striving to mold their intellectual appearance, they naturally have more ungrudging communications with it, being near and ever moving upwards as far as lawful, elevating themselves with the intensity of the divine unswerving love, and receiving the primal illuminations without earthly strain, and ranging themselves to these and having their whole life intellectual. These, then, are they who, at first hand and under many forms, participate in the divine, and, at first hand and under many forms, make known the supremely divine hiddenness. Wherefore, beyond all, they are deemed preeminently worthy of the appellation angelic on the ground that the supremely divine illumination comes to them at first hand, and through them there pass to us manifestations above us. Thus then the law, as the word of God affirms, was given to us through the ministration of angels, and angels led our illustrious fathers before the law and after the law to the divine being, either by leading them to what was to be done, and by converting them from error and an unholy life to the straight way of truth, or by making known to them sacred ordinances or hidden visions, or supramundane mysteries, or certain divine predictions through the prophets. Section 3. But if anyone should say that divine manifestations were made directly and immediately to some holy men, let him learn and that distinction from the most holy oracles that no one hath seen, nor ever shall see, the hidden to crucifixion of Almighty God as it is in itself. Now, divine manifestations were made to the pious as befits revelations of God, that is to say, through certain holy visions analogous to those who see them. Now, the all-wise Word of God, theologia, naturally calls theophany that particular vision which manifests the divine similitude depicted in itself as in a shape of the shapeless, from the elevation of the beholders to the divine beings, since through it a divine illumination comes to the beholders, and the divine persons themselves are religiously initiated into some mystery. But our illustrious fathers were initiated into these divine visions through the mediation of the heavenly power. Does not the tradition of the oracles describe the holy legislation of the law given to Moses as coming straight from God, in order that it may teach us this truth, that it is an outline of a divine and holy legislation? But the Word of God in its wisdom teaches this also, that it came to us through angels, as though the divine regulations were laying down this rule, that through the first, the second are brought to the divine being. For not only with regard to the superior and inferior minds, but even those of the same rank, this law has been established by the supra-essential supreme ordinance, that within each hierarchy there are first and middle and last ranks and powers, and that the more divine are instructors and conductors of the less to the divine access and illumination and participation. Section 4. But I observe that angels first were initiated in the divine mystery of the love of Jesus toward man. Then, through them, the gift of its knowledge passed to us. Thus, for example, the most divine Gabriel instructed Zechariah, the hierarch, that the Son who was to be born to him beyond hope by divine grace should be a prophet of the God incarnate work of the Lord Jesus, to be manifested to the world for its salvation, as becomes the divine goodness, and he revealed to Mary how, in her, should be born the supremely divine mystery of the unutterable God formation. Yet another angel instructed Joseph how, in very truth, should be fulfilled the things divinely promised to his ancestor David. Another declared glad tidings to the shepherds as being purified by their separation from the multitude in their quiet life, and with him a multitude of the heavenly host announced to those on earth that often sung doxology. Let us then ascend to the highest manifestation of light contained in the oracles, for I perceive that even Jesus himself, the super-essential cause of the heavenly beings, when he had come to our condition without change, did not overstep the good order which becomes mankind, which himself arranged and took, but readily subjected himself to the dispositions of the Father and God through angels, and through their mediation was announced to Joseph the departure of the son of Egypt, which had been arranged by the Father, and again the return to Judea from Egypt. And through the angels we see him subjecting himself to the Father's decree. For I forbear to speak as addressing one who knows the teachings of our hierarchical tradition, both concerning the angel who strengthened the Lord Jesus, and that even Jesus himself, when he had come to manifest the good work of our beneficent salvation, was called angel of great counsel. For as he himself says, after the manner of an angel, whatsoever he heard from the Father he announced to us. Chapter 5. For what reason all the heavenly beings are called in common angels? This, then, in our judgment, is the reason for the appellation angelic in the oracles. We must now, I suppose, inquire for what reason the theologian calls all the heavenly beings together angels. But when they come to a more accurate description of the supramundane orders, they name exclusively angelic ranks, with that which completes the full tale of the divine and heavenly hosts. Before this, however, they range preeminently the orders of archangels and the principalities, the authorities and powers, and as many beings as the revealing traditions of the oracles recognize as superior to them. Now we affirm that throughout every sacred ordinance, the superior ranks possess the illumination and powers of their subordinates, but the lowest have not the same powers as those who are above them. The theologians also call the most holy ranks of the highest beings angels, for they also make known the supremely divine illumination. But there is no reason to call the lowest rank of the celestial minds principalities or thrones or seraphims, for it does not possess the highest power, but as it conducts to our inspired hierarchs to the splendor of the Godhead known to it, so also the saintly powers of the beings above it are conductors towards the divine being of that order which completes the angelic hierarchies, except perhaps someone might say this also, that all the angelic appellations are common as regards the subordinate and superior communications of all the celestial powers towards the divine likeness and the gift of light from God. But in order that the question may be better investigated, let us reverently examine the saintly characteristics set forth respecting each celestial order in the oracles. Chapter 6. Which is the first order of the heavenly beings, which the middle, and which the last? How many, and of what sort, are the orders of the supercelestial beings, and how the hierarchies are classified among themselves? I affirm the deifying author of their consecration alone distinctly knows, and further, that they know their own proper powers and illuminations and their sacred and supramundane regularity, for it is impossible that we should know the mysteries of the supercelestial minds and their most holy perfections, except, someone might say, so far as the Godhead has revealed to us through them as knowing perfectly their own condition. We then, will utter nothing as from ourselves, but whatever angelic visions have been gazed upon by the holy prophets of God, we, as initiated in these, will set forth as best we can. The Word of God has designated the whole heavenly beings as 9 by appellation, which show their functions. These our divine initiator divides into threefold orders. He also says that which is always around God is at first and is declared by tradition to be united closely and immediately to him before all the rest. For he says that the teachings of the holy oracles declares that the most holy thrones and the many-eyed and many-winged hosts, named in the Hebrew tongue cherubim and seraphim, are established immediately around God with a nearness superior to all. This threefold order, then, our illustrious guide spoke of as one and of equal rank, and really first hierarchy, than which there is not another more godlike or immediately nearer to the earliest illuminations of the Godhead. But he says that which is composed of the authorities and lordships and powers is second. And as respects the lowest of the heavenly hierarchies, the order of angels and archangels and principalities is third. Chapter 7. Concerning the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones, and concerning their first hierarchy. Section 1. We, whilst admitting this as the arrangement of the holy hierarchies, affirm that every appellation of the celestial minds denote the godlike characteristics of each. And those who know Hebrew affirm that the holy designation of the seraphim denotes either that they are kindling or burning, and that of cherubim, a fullness of knowledge or stream of wisdom. Naturally, then, the first order of the heavenly hierarchies is ministered by the most exalted beings, holding, as it does, a rank which is higher than all, from the fact that it is established immediately around God, and that the first wrought divine manifestations and perfections pass earlier to it as being nearest. They are called then burning and thrones and streams of wisdom, by a name which sets forth their godlike conditions. The appellation of seraphim plainly teaches their ever-moving around things divine, and constancy and warmth and keenness, and the seething of that persistence, indomitable and inflexible perpetual motion, and the vigorous assimilation and elevation of the subordinate, as giving new life and rekindling them to the same heat, and purifying through fire and burnt offering, and the light-like and light-shedding characteristic which can never be concealed or consumed, and remain always the same, which destroys and dispels every kind of obscure darkness. But the appellation of the cherubim denotes their knowledge and their vision of God, and their readiness to receive the highest gift of light, and their power of contemplating the super-divine comeliness in its first revealed power, and their being filled anew with the impartation which maketh wise, and their ungrudging communication to those next to them by the stream of the given wisdom. The appellation of the most exalted and preeminent thrones denotes their manifest exaltation from every groveling inferiority, and their supramundane tendency toward higher things, and their unswerving separation from all remoteness, and their invariable and firmly fixed settlement around the veritable highness with the whole force of their powers, and their receptivity of the supremely divine approach in the absence of all passion and earthly tendency, and their bearing God, and the ardent expansion of themselves for the divine reception. Section 2. This, then, is the revelation of their names, so far as we can give it, and we ought to say what we think their hierarchy is, for I suppose we have sufficiently shown above that for the purpose of every hierarchy is an unswerving devotion to the divine imitation of the divine likeliness, and that every hierarchical function is set apart from the sacred reception and distribution of an undefiled purification and divine light and perfecting science. And now I pray that I may speak worthily of the most exalted minds, how the hierarchy amongst them is exhibited through the oracles. One must consider then that the hierarchy is akin, and in every respect like to the first beings who are established after the Godhead, who gave them being and are marshaled as it were in its very vestibule, who surpass every unseen and seen created power. We must then regard them as pure, not as though they had been freed from unholy stains and blemishes, nor yet as though they were unreceptive of earthly fancies, but as far exalted above every strain of remissness and inferior holiness, as befits the highest degree of purity, established above the most godlike powers, and clinging unflinchingly to their own self-moved and same-moved rank in their invariable love of God, conscious in no respect whatever of declivity to a worse condition, but having the unsullied fixity of their own godlike identity, never liable to fall and always unmoved, and again as contemplative, not contemplators of intellectual symbols as sensible, nor as being led to the divine being as the very texture of holy representations written for meditation, but as being filled with all kinds of immaterial knowledge of higher light and satiated as permissible with the beautifying and original beauty of super-essential and thrice manifested contemplation, and thus, being deemed worthy of the communion with Jesus, they do not stamp pictorially the deifying similitude in the divinely formed images, but as being really near to him in first participation of the knowledge of his deifying illuminations, nay more, that the imitation of God is given to them in the highest degree possible, and they participate so far as is allowable to them in his deifying and philanthropic virtues, in the power of a first manifestation, and likewise as perfected, not as being illuminated with an analytic science of sacred variety, but as being filled with a first and preeminent deification, as beseems the most exalted science of the works of God possible in angels, for not through other holy beings, but being ministered from the very Godhead, and by the immediate elevation to it, by their power and rank surpassing all, they are both established near the all-holy with any shadow of turning, and without any shadow of turning, and are conducted for contemplation to the immaterial and intelligible comeliness as far as permissible, and are initiated into the scientific methods of the works of God as being first, and around God being ministered in the highest degree from every source of consecration. Section 3. This, then, the theologians distinctly show, viz., that the subordinate orders of the heavenly beings are taught by the superior, in due order, the deifying sciences, and that those who are higher than all are illuminated from Godhead itself as far as permissible in revelations of divine mysteries. For they introduce some of them as being religiously instructed by those of a higher rank that he who was raised to heaven as man is Lord of the heavenly powers and King of glory, and others as questioning Jesus himself, as desiring to be instructed in the science of his divine work on our behalf, and Jesus himself teaching them immediately and showing to them at first hand his beneficent work out of love to man. For I, he says, am speaking of righteousness and judgment of salvation. Now I am astonished that even the first of the beings in heaven, and so far above all, should reverently strive after the supremely divine illuminations as intermediate beings, for they do not ask directly, "Wherefore are thy garments red?" But they first raise the question among themselves, showing that they desire to learn and crave the deifying knowledge, and not anticipating the illumination given after a divine procedure. The first hierarchy, then, of the heavenly minds is purified and enlightened and perfected, and being ministered from the very author of initiation through its elevation to it immediately, being filled according to its degree with altogether most holy purifications of the unreproachable light of the pre-perfect source of initiation, unstained indeed by any remissness, and full of primal light, and perfected by its participation in first given knowledge and science. But to sum up, I may say this, not inappropriately, that the reception of the supremely divine science is both purification and enlightenment and perfecting, purifying as it were from ignorance by the knowledge of the more perfect revelations imparted to it according to fitness, enlightening by the self-same divine knowledge, through which it also purifies that which did not before contemplate the things which are now made manifest through the higher illuminations, and perfecting further by the self-same light through the abiding science of the mysteries made clearly manifest. Section 4. This, then, according to my science, is the first rank of the heavenly beings, which encircle and stand immediately around God, and without symbol and without interruption, dancing round his eternal knowledge in the most exalted ever-moving stability, as in angels, viewing purely many and blessed contemplations, and illuminated with simple and immediate splendor, and filled with divine nourishment. Many indeed by the first given profusion, but one by the unvariegated and unifying oneness of the supremely divine banquet, deemed worthy indeed of much participation and cooperation with God, by their assimilation to him as far as attainable of their excellent habits and energy, and knowing many divine things preeminently, and participating in supremely divine science and knowledge as is lawful. Wherefore the word of God has transmitted its hymns to those on earth, in which are divinely shown the excellency of its most exalted illumination. For some of its members, to speak after sensible perceptions, proclaim as voice of many waters, Blessed is the Lord, blessed is the glory of the Lord from his place. And others cry aloud that frequent and most august hymn of God, Holy, 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 Lord of Sabbath. The whole earth is full of his glory. These most excellent hymnologies of supercelestial minds we have already unfolded to the best of our ability in the treatise concerning the divine hymns, and have spoken sufficiently concerning them in that treatise, from which, by way of remembrance, it is not enough to produce so much as is necessary to the present occasion, namely, that the first order, having been illuminated from the supremely divine goodness as permissible in the theological science as a hierarchy reflecting that goodness transmitted to those next to it, teaching briefly this, that it is just and right that the august Godhead, itself both above praise and all praiseworthy, should be known and extolled by the God-receptive minds as is attainable, for they, as images of God, are, as the oracles say, the divine places of the supremely divine repose, and further that it is monad and unit, trisubsistent, sending forth his most kindly forethought to all things, being from the super-heavenly minds to the lowest of the earth, as super-original origin and cause of every essence, and grasping all things super-essentially in a resistless embrace. Chapter 8. Concerning lordships and powers and authorities, and concerning their middle hierarchy. Section 1. Let us now pass to the middle order of the heavenly minds, gazing as far as we may with supermundane eyes upon those lordships and truly terrible visions of the divine authorities and powers. For each appellation of the beings above us manifests their God-imitating characteristics of the divine likeness. I think then that the explanatory name of the holy lordship denotes a certain unslavish elevation, free from all groveling subserviency, as becomes the free, and not submitting itself in any way whatsoever to one of the tyrannical dissimilarities as a cruel lordship, superior to every kind of cringing slavery, indomitable to every subservience, and elevated above every dissimilarity, ever aspiring to the true lordship and the source of lordship, and molding as an image of goodness itself and those after it to its lordly bearing as attainable, turning itself wholly to none of the things that vainly seem, but to the lordly being, and ever sharing in the lordly likeness of God to its utmost ability. And the appellation of the holy powers denotes a certain courageous and unflinching virility for all those godlike energies within them, not feebly weak for the reception of any of the divine illuminations, vouchsafed to it vigorously conducted to the divine imitation, not forsaking the godlike movements through its own unmanliness, but unflinchingly looking to the superessential and making power, and becoming a power-like image of this, as far as it is attainable, and powerfully turned to this as source of power, and issuing forth to those next in degree, in gift of power, and in likeness to God, and that the appellation of the holy authorities of the same rank as the divine lordships and powers denotes the beautiful and unconfused good order with regard to the divine receptions, and the discipline of the supramundane and intellectual authority, not using the authoritative powers imperiously for the base purposes, but conducted indomitably with good order toward divine things, and conducting those after it benignly, and assimilated as far as permissible to the authoritative source of authority, and making this visible as is possible to the angels in the well-ordered ranks of the authoritative power within the middle order of the heavenly minds, having these godlike characteristics, is purified and illuminated and perfected in the manner described by the divine illuminations vouchsafed to it at second hand through the first hierarchical order, and passing through this middle as a secondary manifestation. Second section number 2. No doubt, as regards that message which is said to pass through one angel to another, we may take it as a symbol of a perfecting completed from afar and obscured by reason of its passage to the second rank. For as men skilled in our sacred initiations say, the fullness of divine things manifested directly to ourselves is more perfecting than the divine contemplations imparted through others. Thus, I think the immediate participation of the angelic ranks elevated in the first degree to God is more clear than those perfected through the instrumentality of others. Wherefore, by our sacerdotal tradition, the first minds are named perfecting and illuminating and purifying powers of the subordinate, who are conducted through them to the superessential origin of all things, and participate as far as is permissible to them in the consecrating purifications and illuminations and perfections. For this is divinely fixed absolutely by the divine source of order, that through the first, the second partake of the supremely divine illuminations. This you will find declared by the theologians in many ways. For when the divine and paternal love toward man, whilst chastening in a startling manner his people Israel for their religious preservation, after delivering them to terrible and savage nations for correction by various leadings of his guided people to better things, both liberated them from their misery and mildly led them back through his compassion to their former state of comfort. One of the theologians, Zechariah, sees one of the first angels, as I think, and near God, for the angelic appellation is common, as I said, to them all, learning from God himself the comforting words, as they are called, concerning this matter. And another angel of inferior rank, advancing to meet the first, as for reception and participation of enlightenment. Then by him instructed in the divine purpose as from a hierarch, and charged to reveal to the theologian that Jerusalem should be abundantly occupied by a multitude of people. And another theologian, Ezekiel, says that this was righteously ordained by the by the glorious deity itself seated above the cherubim, for paternal love towards man, conducting Israel, as we have said, through chastisement to better things, by a righteousness worthy of God, deemed right to separate the guilty from the guiltless. This is the first revealed to one after the cherubim, who was bound about the loins with the sapphire and wore displayed the robe coming down to the feet as a hierarchical symbol. But the divine government enjoins the other angels who bore the battle axes to be instructed from the former as to the divine judgment in this matter. For to one he said that he should go through the midst of Jerusalem and place the sign upon the forehead of the innocent men, but to others, go into the city after him and strike, and draw not back your eyes, but to every one upon whom is the sign, draw not near. What would anyone say concerning the angel who said to Daniel, the word has gone forth? Or concerning him, the first, who took the fire from the midst of the cherubim? Or what is the more remarkable than this for showing the good order amongst the angels, that the cherubim cast the fire into the hands of him who wears the sacred vestment? Or concerning him who called the most divine Gabriel and said to him, make this man understand this vision. And whatever else is recorded by the holy theologians concerning the godlike order of the heavenly hierarchies, by being assimilated to which, as far as possible, the discipline of our hierarchy will have the angelic comeliness as it were in reflection, molded through it and conducted to the super-essential source of order in every hierarchy. Chapter 9, concerning the principalities, archangels, and angels, and concerning their last hierarchy. Section 1. There remains for our reverent contemplation a division which completes the angelic hierarchies, that divided into the godlike principalities, archangels, and angels. I think it is necessary to declare first the meaning of their sacred appellations to the best of my ability. For that of the heavenly principalities manifests their princely and leading function after the divine example, with order religious and most befitting the princely, and their being wholly turned to the super princely prince, and leading others in princely fashion, and being molded as far as possible to that prince-making princedom itself, and to manifest its super essential princely order by the regularity of the princely powers. Section 2. The order of the order of the holy archangels is of the same rank with the heavenly principalities. For there is one hierarchy and division, as I said, of them and the angels. But since there is not a hierarchy which does not possess first and middle and last powers, the holy order of archangels occupies the middle position in the hierarchy between the extremes, for it belongs alike to the most holy principalities and to the holy angels. To the principalities, because it is turned in a princely fashion to the super-essential princedom, and is molded to it as far as attainable, and unites the angels after the fashion of its own well-regulated and marshaled and invisible leadings. And it belongs to the angels because it is the messenger order, receiving hierarchically the divine illuminations from the first powers, and announcing the same to the angels in a godly manner, and through angels manifesting to us in proportion to the religious aptitude of each of the godly persons illuminated. For the angels, as we have said, complete the whole series of heavenly minds, as being the last order of the heavenly beings who possess the angelic characteristics. Yea, rather, they are more properly named angels by us than those of a higher degree, because their hierarchy is occupied with the more manifest, and is more particularly concerned with the things of the world. For the very highest order, as being placed in the first rank near the hidden one, we must consider as directing in spiritual things the second hiddenly, and that the second, which is composed of the holy lordships and powers and authorities, leads the hierarchy of the principalities and archangels and angels more clearly indeed than the first order, but more hiddenly than the order after it, and the revealing order of the principalities, archangels, and angels presides through each other over the hierarchies amongst men, in order that the elevation and conversion and communion and union with God may be in due order, and further also that the procession from God vouchsafe benignly to all the hierarchies, and passing in all common, may be also with most sacred regularity. Hence, the word of God has assigned our hierarchy to angel, by naming Michael as ruler of the Jewish people, and others over other nations, for the Most High established borders of nations according to the number of angels of God. Section 3. But if anyone should say, how then were the people of the Hebrews alone conducted to the supremely divine illuminations? We must answer that we ought not to throw the blame of the other nations wandering after those which are no gods upon the direct guidance of the angels, but that they themselves by their own declination fell away from the direct leading toward the divine being through self-conceit and self-will, and through their irrational veneration for things which appeared to them worthy of God. Even the Hebrew people are said to have suffered the same thing, for he says, "Thou I hast cast away knowledge of God, and hast gone after thine own heart." For neither have we a life governed by necessity, nor on account of the free will of those who are objects of providential care, are the divine rays of the providential illumination blunted, but the inaptitude of the mental visions make the overflowing light gift of the paternal goodness either altogether unparticipated or impenetrable to their resistance, or makes the participations of one fontal ray diverse, small, or great, obscure, or brilliant, although that ray is one and simple, and always the same and ever-flowing. For even if over the other nations, from whom we have also emerged to that boundless and bounteous sea of divine light, which is readily expanded for the ready reception of all, certain not alien gods were wont to preside, yet there is one head of all, and to this the angels who religiously direct each nation conduct those who follow them. Let us consider Melchizedek as being a hierarch, most dear to God, not of gods which are not, but of the most truly most high God. For the godly wise did not call Melchizedek simply dear to God, but also priest, in order that they may clearly show to the wise that not only was he himself turned to the true God, but further that he was guide to the others, as he hierarch of the elevation to the true and only Godhead. Section 4. Let me also recall to your hierarchical judgment, that both to the Pharaoh from the angel who presided over the Egyptians, and to the Babylonian prince from his own angel, the watchful and ruling care of the providence and lordship over all was interpreted in visions. And for those nations, the worshippers of the true God were appointed leaders for the interpretation of things shaped by angelic visions, revealed from God through angels, some holy men akin to the angels, Daniel and Joseph. For there is one prince and providence over all, and never must we think that the Godhead is leader of the Jews by lot, and that angels, independently or as of equal rank or in opposition, or that certain other gods preside over the other nations. But that peculiar phrase of the divine word must be accepted according to the following sacred intention, not as though God had divided government amongst men with other gods or angels, and had been elected by lot to the government and leadership of Israel, but in this sense, whilst one providence of highest over all assigned all mankind savingly to the direct conduct of their own angels, yet Israel, almost alone in comparison with all, turned himself to the light gift and recognition of the Lord, hence the word of God, as showing that Israel elected himself for the worship of the true God, says this: he became Lord's portion. and as indicating that he was assigned equally with the other nations to one of the holy angels for the recognition through him of the head of all, said that Michael became leader of the Jewish people, demonstrating distinctly that there is one providence of the whole superessentially established above all the powers, unseen and seen, and that the angels who preside over each nation elevate as far as possible those who follow them with a willing mind to it as their proper head. Chapter 10. A repetition and summary of the angelic discipline. Section 1. We have concluded then that the most revered order of the minds around God, ministered by the perfecting illumination through its immediate elevation to it, is purified and illuminated and perfected by a gift of light from the Godhead, more hidden and more manifest, more hidden indeed as being more intelligible and more simplifying and more unifying, more manifest as being a first gift and a first manifestation, and more complete and more effused to it as transparent. And from this order again in due degree the second, and from the second the third, and from the third our hierarchy is reverently conducted to the super-original origin and end of all good order, according to the selfsame law of well-ordered regularity in divine harmony and proportion. Section 2. Now all angels are interpreters of those above them, the most revered indeed of God, who moves them, and the rest in due degree of those who have been moved by God. For to such an extent has the superessential harmony of all things provided for the religious order and the regulated conduct of each of the rational and intellectual beings, that each of the rank of the hierarchies has been placed in sacred order, and we observe every hierarchy distributed to the first and middle and last powers. But to speak accurately, he distinguished each division himself by the same divine harmonies, wherefore the theologians say that the most divine seraphim cry one to another, indicating distinctly, as I think by this, that the first impart their knowledge of divine things to the second. Section 3. I might add this not inappropriately, that each heavenly and human mind has within itself its own special first and middle and last ranks, and powers manifested severally in due degree for the aforesaid particular mystical meanings of the hierarchical illuminations, according to which each one participates so far as is lawful and attainable to him in the most spotless purification, the most copious light, the preeminent perfection, for there is nothing that is self-perfect or absolutely without need of perfecting, except the really self-perfect and preeminently perfect. Chapter 11. For what reason all the heavenly beings in common are called heavenly powers. Section 1. Now that we have defined these things, it is worthy of consideration for what reason we are accustomed to call all the angelic beings together heavenly powers. For it is not possible to say, as we may of the angels, that the order of the holy powers is last of all. The orders of the superior beings share in the saintly illuminations of the last, but the last in no wise of the first, and on this account all the divine minds are called heavenly powers, but never seraphim in thrones and lordships, for the last do not enjoy the whole characteristics of the highest. For the angels and those above the angels, archangels and principalities and authorities, placed by the word of God after the powers, are often in common called by us in conjuncture with the other holy beings, heavenly powers. Section 2. But we affirm that whilst often using the appellation heavenly powers for all in common, we do not introduce a sort of confusion of the characteristics of each order, but inasmuch as all the divine minds by the supramundane description given of them are distributed into three, into essence, and power and energy, into essence and power and energy, when we speak of them, or some of them indiscriminately, as heavenly beings or heavenly powers, we must consider that we manifest those about whom we speak in general way, from their essence or power severally, for we must not apply the superior characteristics of those holy powers whom we have already sufficiently distinguished to the beings which are entirely inferior to them, so as to not overthrow the unconfused order of the angelic ranks. For according to the correct order which we have already frequently given, the superior orders possess abundantly the characteristics of the inferior, but the lowest do not possess the superior completeness of the more reverended, since the first manifested illuminations are revealed to them through the first order in proportion to their capacity. Chapter 12. Why the hierarchs among men are called angels. Section 1. But this is sometimes also asked by diligent contemplators of the intelligible oracles, inasmuch as the lower orders do not possess the completeness of the superior. For what reason is our hierarch named by the oracles angel of the sovereign Lord? Section 2. Now this statement, as I think, is not contrary to what has been before defined, for we say that the last lack the complete and preeminent power of the more reverend divisions, for they participate in the partial and analogous, according to the one harmonious and binding fellowship of all things. For example, the rank of the holy cherubim participates in higher wisdom and knowledge, but the division of beings beneath them participate they also in wisdom and knowledge, but nevertheless partially as compared with them, and in a lower degree, for the participation of wisdom and knowledge throughout is common to all the minds which bear the image of God, but the being near and first, or second and inferior, is not common, but as has been determined for each in its own degree. This also one might safely define respecting all the divine minds, for as the first possess abundantly the saintly characteristics of the inferior, so the last possess those of the superior, not indeed in the same degree, but subordinately. There is then, as I think, nothing absurd if the word of God calls our hierarch angel, since he participates, according to his own capacity, in the messenger characteristic of the angels, and elevates him as far as attainable to men, to the likeness of their office. Section 3. But you will find that the word of God calls gods both the heavenly beings above us and the most beloved of God and holy men among us, although the divine hiddenness is transcendentally elevated and established above all, and no created being properly and wholly be said and no being can properly and wholly be said to be like unto it, except those intellectual and rational beings who are entirely and wholly tuned to its oneness as far as possible, and who elevate themselves incessantly to its divine illuminations as far as attainable by their imitation of God, if I may so speak, according to their power, and are deemed worthy of the same nature. Chapter 13. For what reason the prophet Isaiah is said to have been purified by the seraphim? Section 1. Come then, let us examine this as best as we can, why the seraphim is said to be sent to one of the theologians. For some one may object that not one of the inferior angels, but he, the enrolled among the most reverend beings, cleanses the prophet. Section 2. Some then affirm that, according to the definition already given of the mutual relation of all the minds, the logion does not name the one of the highest around God as having come for the cleansing of the theologian, but some one of the angels placed over us as a sacred minister of the prophet's cleansing is called by the same name as the seraphim, on the ground that the removal of the fault spoken of and the restoration of him who was cleansed for the divine mission was through fire. And they say that the logion speaks simply of the one of the seraphim, not one of those who are established around God, but one of the powers set over us for the purpose of cleansing. Section 3. Now another man brought forward to me by no means foolish defense of the present position, for he said that Great One, whoever he was, the angel who formed this vision for the purpose of teaching the theologian divine things, referred his own cleansing function to God and after God to the first working hierarchy. And was this statement certainly true? For he who said this affirmed that the supremely divine power in visiting all advances and penetrates all irresistibly, and yet is invisible to all, not only as being essentially elevated above it, but as secretly transmitting its providential energies to all. Yea, rather, it is manifest to all the intellectual beings in due degree, and by conducting its own gift of light to the most reverend beings, through them as first it distributes in due order to the subordinate according to the power of each division to bear the vision of God. Or, so to speak more strictly, and through familiar illustrations, for if they fall short of the glory of God, who is exalted above all, yet they are more illustrating for us. The distribution of the sun's rays passes with easy distribution to the first matter, as being more transparent than all, and through it with greater clearness lights up its own splendors. But when it strikes more dense materials, its distributed brilliancy becomes more obscure from the inaptitude of the materials illumined for the transmission of the gift of light. And from this it naturally contracted so as to entirely exclude the passage of light. Again, the heat of fire transmits itself chiefly to things that are more receptive and yielding and conductive to assimilation to itself. But as regards repellent opposing substances, it leaves none or very light trace of its fiery energy. And further, when through substances favorable to its proper action, it comes in contact with things not congenial, first it perchance makes things easily changed to heating hot, and through them heats proportionately either water or something else which is not easily heated. After the same rule, then, of nature's well-ordered method, the regulation of all good order, both visible and invisible, manifests supernaturally the brightness of its own gift of light in first manifestation to the most exalted beings in abundant streams, and through these the beings after them partake of the divine ray. For these, as knowing God first and striving preeminently after divine virtue, and to become first workers, are deemed worthy of the power of an energy for the imitation of God as attainable, and these benevolently elevate the beings after them to an equality as far as possible by imparting ungrudgingly to them the splendor which rests upon them. And these, again, to the subordinate, then through the order, and throughout each order, the first rank imparts its gift to that after, and the divine light thus rests upon all in due proportion with providential forethought. There is then for all those who are illuminated a source of illumination, viz. God by nature and really and properly as essence of light and cause of being and vision itself, but by ordinance and for divine imitation the relatively superior is source, for each after it by the fact that the divine rays are poured through it to that. All the remaining angelic beings then naturally regard the highest order of the heavenly minds as source after God of every God knowledge and God imitation, since through them the supremely divine illumination is distributed to all and to us. Wherefore they refer to every holy energy of divine imitation to God indeed as cause, but to the first godlike minds as first agents and teachers of things divine. The first order, then, of the holy angels possesses more than all the characteristics of fire, and the dreaming distribution of supremely divine wisdom, and the faculty of knowing the highest science of the divine illuminations, and the characteristic of thrones exhibiting their expansion for the reception of God, and the ranks of the subordinate beings possess indeed the empyrean, the wise, the knowing, the God-receptive faculty, but subordinately, and by looking to the first, and through them as being deemed worthy of the divine imitation in first operation, are conducted to the attainable likeness of God. The aforesaid holy characteristics, then, which the beings after them possess through the first, they attribute to those beings themselves after gods as hierarchs. Section 4. He who said this used to affirm that this vision was shown to the theologian through one of the holy and blessed angels set over us, and that from his illuminating direction he was elevated to that intellectual contemplation which he saw the most exalted being seated to speak symbolically under God, and with God, and around God, and the super princely eminence elevated unspeakably above them all, seated on high in the midst of the superior powers. The theologian then learned from the thing seen that, as compared with every supra-essential preeminence, the divine being was seated incomparably above every visible and invisible power, yea, even that it is exalted above all as the reality of all things, as absolute, not even to the first of the created beings. Further also, that it is all source and essentiating cause, an unalterable fixity of the undissolved continuance of all things, from which is both the being and the well-being of the most exalted powers themselves. Then he revealed that the godlike powers of the most holy seraphim themselves, whose sacred appellation signifies the fiery, concerning which we shall shortly speak as best we can, conducted the elevations of the empyrean power to the divine likeness. And the holy theologian, by viewing the description of free and most exalted elevation of the sixfold wings to the divine being in first, middle, and last conceptions, and further their endless feet and many faces, and their extended wings, one under their feet and the other over their face, as seen in vision, that the perpetual movement of their middle wings was brought to the intelligible knowledge of the things seen, since there was manifested to him the power of the most exalted minds for deep penetration and contemplation, and the sacred reverence which they have supramundanely for the bold and courageous and unattainable scrutiny into higher and deeper mysteries, and of the incessant and high-flying perpetual motion of their godlike energies in due proportion. But he was also taught the hidden mysteries of that supremely divine and much esteemed hymn of praise, whilst the angel who formed the vision imparts as far as possible his own sacred knowledge to the theologian. He also taught him this, that the participation, as far as attainable in the supremely divine and radiant purity, is a purification to the pure, however pure, and it being accomplished from the very Godhead by most exalted causes, for all the sacred minds by a supra-essential hiddenness, is in a manner more clear, and exhibits and distributes itself in a higher degree to the highest powers around it. But with regard to the second, or us, the lowest mental powers, as each is distinct from, as regards the divine likeness, so it contracts its brilliant illumination to the single unknowable of its own hiddenness, and it illuminates the second severally through the first, and if one must speak briefly, is firstly brought from the hiddenness to manifestation through the first powers. This, then, the theologian was taught by the angel who was leading him to light, that purification and the supremely divine operations, illuminating through the first beings, are distributed to the rest according to the relation of each for the deifying participations. Wherefore he reasonably attributed to the seraphim after God the characteristic of purification of fire. There is nothing then absurd if the seraphim is said to purify the prophet, for as God purifies all, by being cause of every purification. Yea, rather, for I use a familiar illustration, just as our hierarch, when purifying or enlightening through his liturgios, torjoi, or priest, is said himself to purify and enlighten, since the orders consecrated through him attribute to their own proper sacred operations, so also the angel who effected the purification of the theologian attributes to his own purifying science and power to God, indeed as cause, but to the seraphim as first operating hierarch, as any one might say with angelic reverence, whilst teaching one who was being purified by him. There is a preeminent source and essence and worker and cause of the cleansing wrought upon you from me, he who brings both the first being into being and holds them together by their fixity around himself and keeps them without charge and without fail, moving them to the first participations of his own providential energies. For this, he who taught me these things used to say, shows the mission of the seraphim. But as hierarch and leader after God, the marshal of the most exalted beings, from whom I was taught to purify after the example of God, this is he who cleanses thee through me, through whom the cause and creator of all cleansing brought forth his own provident energies from the hidden even to us. These things, then, he taught me, and I impart them to thee. Let it be a part of thy intellectual and discriminating skill, either to acquit each of the causes assigned from objection, and to honor this before the other as having likelihood and good reason, and perhaps the truth, or to find out from yourself something more allied to real truth, or to learn from another, God, of course, giving expression, and angels supplying it, and reveal to us, the friends of angels, a view more luminous if it should be so, and to me specifically welcome. Chapter 14. Chapter 14. What the traditional number of angels signifies. This is also worthy, in my opinion, of intellectual attention, that the tradition of the oracles concerning the angels affirm that they are thousands, a myriads, accumulating and multiplying to themselves the supreme limits of our numbers, and through these showing clearly that the ranks of the heavenly beings cannot be numbered by us. For many are the blessed hosts of the supramundane minds, surpassing the weak and contracted measurement of our material number, and being definitely known by their own supramundane and heavenly intelligences and science alone, which is given to them in profusion by the supremely divine and omniscient framer of wisdom, and essentiating cause and connecting force and encompassing term of all created things together. Chapter 15. What are the morphic likenesses of the angelic powers? What the fiery? What the anthropomorphic? What are the eyes? What are the nostrils? What are the ears? What are the mouths? What the touch? What the eyelids? What the eyebrows? What the prime? What the teeth? What the shoulders? What the elbows and the hands? What the heart? What the beasts? What the breast, what the back, what the feet, what the wings, what the nakedness, what the robe, what the shining raiment, what the sacerdotal, what the girdles, what the rods, what the spears, what the battle axes, what the measuring lines, what the winds, what the clouds, what the brass, what the electron, what the choirs, what the clapping hands, what the colors of different stones, what the appearance of the lion, what the appearance of the ox, what the appearance of the eagle, what the horses, what the varieties of colored horses, what the rivers, what the chariots, what the wheels, and what the so-called joy of the angels. Section 1. Come then, let us at last, if you please, rest our mental visions from the strain of lofty contemplation befitting angels, and descend to the divided and manifold breadth of the many-shaped varieties of the angelic forms, and then return analytically from the same, and as from images, to the simplicity of the heavenly minds. But let this first be made plain to you, that the explanations of this sacredly depicted likeness represents the same ranks of the heavenly beings, as sometimes ruling and at other times as being ruled, and the last ruling and the first being ruled, and the same, as has been said, having first, middle, and last powers, without introducing anything absurd into the description, according to the following method of explanation. For if indeed we were to say that some are ruled by those above them, and then that they rule the same, and that those above, whilst ruling those below, are ruled by the same who are being ruled, the thing would be manifestly absurd and mixed with all sorts of confusion. But if we say that the same rule and are ruled, but no longer the self-same, or from the self-same, but each same is ruled by those before and rules those below, one might say appropriately that the divinely pictured presentations in the oracles may sometimes attribute properly and truly the very same, both to first and middle and last powers. Now the straining elevations to things, and their being drawn unswervingly around each other, as being guardians of their own proper powers, and that they participate in the providential faculties to provide for those below them by mutual communication, befit truly all the heavenly beings, although some preeminently and wholly, as we have often said, and others partially and subordinately. Section 2. But we must keep our discourse within bounds, and must search in our first explanation of the types. For whatever reason, the Word of God prefers this sacred description of fire in preference to almost every other. You will find it then representing not only wheels of fire, but also living creatures of fire, and men flashing, as it were, the lightning, and placing around the heavenly beings themselves heaps of coals of fire, and rivers of flames flowing with irresistible force. And also it says that the thrones are of fire, and that the most exalted seraphim glow with fire. It shows from their appellation, and it attributes the characteristic and energy of fire to them. Throughout, above and below, it prefers preeminently the representation of the image of fire. I think, then, the similitude of fire denotes the likeliness of the heavenly minds to God in the highest degree, for the holy theologians frequently describe the superessential and formless essence of fire as having many likenesses, if I may be permitted to say so, of the supremely divine property as invisible things. For the sensible fire is, so to speak, in everything, and passeth through everything unmingled, and springs from all, and whilst all luminous is, as it were hidden, unknown, in its essential nature, when there is no material lying near it upon which it may show its proper energy. It is both uncontrollable and invisible, self-subduing all things, and bringing under its own energy anything in which it may happen to be, varying, imparting itself to all things near it, whatever they may be, renewing by its rousing heat, and giving light by its uncovered illuminations, invincible, unmingled, separating, unchangeable, elevating, penetrating, lofty, subject to no groveling inferiority, ever moving, self-moving, moving other things, comprehending and comprehended, needing no other, imperceptibly increasing itself, displaying its own majesty to the materials receiving it, energetic, powerful, present to all invisibly, unobserved, seeming not to be, and manifesting itself suddenly according to its own proper nature by friction, as it were by a sort of seeking, and again flying away impalpably, undiminished in all joyful characteristics of itself. And one might find many characteristics of fire appropriate to display the supremely divine energy in sensible things. The godly wise, then, knowing this, depict the celestial beings from fire, showing their godliness and imitation of God as far as attainable. Section 3. But they also depict them under the likeness of men on account of the intellectual faculty and their having powers of looking upward, and their straight and direct form, and their innate faculty of ruling and guiding, and whilst being least in physical strength as compared with the other powers of irrational creatures, yet ruling over all by their superior power of mind, and by their dominion in consequence of rational science, and their innate unslavishness and indomitableness of soul. It is possible then, I think, to find within each of the many parts of our body harmonious images of the heavenly powers, by affirming that the powers of vision denote the most transparent elevation toward the divine lights, and again the tender and liquid and not repellent, but sensitive and pure and unfolded reception from all passion, free from all passions, of supremely divine illuminations. Now the discriminating powers of the nostrils denote the being able to receive, as far as attainable, the sweet-smelling largesse beyond conception, and to distinguish accurately things which are not such, and to reject. The powers of the ear denote the participation of and conscious reception of the supremely divine inspiration. The powers of taste denote the fullness of the intelligible nourishment and the reception of divine and nourishing streams. The power of touch denotes the skillful discrimination that which is suitable or injurious. The eyelids and eyebrows denote the guarding of the conceptions which see God. The figures of manhood and youth denote the perpetual bloom and vigor of life. The teeth denote the dividing of the nourishing perfection given to us, for each intellectual being divides and multiplies by a provident faculty, and the unified conception given to it by the more divine, for the proportionate elevation of the inferior. The shoulders and the elbows, and further the hands, denote the power of making and operating and accomplishing. The heart, again, is a symbol of the God-like life dispersing its own life-giving power to the objects of its forethought as beseems the good. The chest, again, denotes the invincible and protective faculty of the life-giving distribution as being placed above the heart. The back holding together the whole productive power of life. The feet denote the moving and quickness and skillfulness of the perpetual motion advancing toward divine things. Wherefore also the word of God, arranged by the feet of the holy minds under their wings, for their wings display the elevating quickness and the heavenly progress towards higher things, and the superiority to every groveling thing by reason of the ascending, and the lightness of the wings denote their being in no respect earthly, but undefiled and lightly raised to the sublime, and the naked and unshod denotes the unfettered, agile, and unrestrained, and free from all external superfluidity, and assimilation to the divine simplicity as far as attainable. Section 4. But since again the simple and variegated wisdom both clothes the naked and distributes certain implements to them to carry, come, let us unfold according to our power the sacred garments and the implements of the celestial minds. The shining and glowing raiment, I think, signifies the divine likeness of the image of fire, and their enlightening in consequence of their repose in heaven, where is the light, and their complete illumination intelligibly, and their being illuminated intellectually, and the sacerdotal robe denotes their conducting to divine and mystical visions and the consecration of their whole life. And the girdles signify the guard over their productive powers, and the collected habit of being turned uniformly to it and being drawn around itself by an unbroken identity in a well-ordered circle. Section 5. Section 5. The rods signify the kingly and directing faculty, making all things straight. The spears and the battle axes denote the dividing of things unlike, and the sharp and energetic and drastic operations of the discriminating powers. The geometrical and technical articles denote the founding and building and completing, and whatever else belongs to the elevating and guiding forethought for the subordinate orders. But sometimes the implements assigned to the holy angels are symbols of God's judgments to ourselves, some representing his correcting instruction and avenging righteousness, others freedom from peril or the end of education or resumption of former well-being or addition of other gifts, great or small, sensible or intelligible. Nor would a discriminating mind in any case have any difficulty in properly adapting things visible to things invisible. Section 6. But the fact that they are named winds denotes their rapid actions, passing almost instantaneous to all things, and their transporting movement passing from above to below, and again from below to above. They're elevating the second to the height above, and moving the first to a common and provident advance of the inferior orders. But perhaps someone would say that the appellation wind to the aerial spirits also denotes the divine likeliness of heavenly minds, for this also bears a likeness and type of the supremely divine energy, as we have demonstrated more fully in the symbolic theology in our explanation of the four elements, in accordance with the moving and life-producing and the rapid resistless development of nature and the hiddenness of the moving sources and terminations to unknown and invisible. For he says, "Thou knowest not whence it comes, nor whither it goes," but also the word of God attributes to them the appearance of a cloud, signifying through this that the holy minds are filled supermundanely with the hidden light, receiving the first manifestation without boasting over it as such, which they distribute ungrudgingly to the second, as the secondary manifestation in proportion to capacity. Yea, further, that the productive and life-producing and increasing and perfecting power is enshrined in them after the fashion of the intelligible production of showers, which summons the receptive womb of the earth by fruitful rains to the life-giving pangs of birth. Section 7. Also, the Word of God attributes to the heavenly beings a likeness to brass, electron, and many colored stones. Electron, as being partly like gold, partly like silver, denotes the incorruptible, as in gold, and unexpended and undiminished and spotless brilliancy and brightness, as in silver, and a luminous and heavenly radiance. But to the brass, according to the reasons assigned, must be attributed either the likeness of fire or that of gold. We must consider that the many-colored appearances of stones denote either as white, the luminous, or as red, the fiery, or as yellow, the golden, or as green, the youthful and full-grown. And within each likeness you will find an explanation which teaches the inner meaning of the typical images. But since I think according to our power this has been sufficiently said, let us pass to the sacred explanation of the divine representations of the heavenly minds through wild beasts. We must consider that the shape of a lion signifies the leading and robust and indomitable, and the assimilation as far as possible to the unutterable Godhead by the concealment of the intellectual footprints, and by the mystically modest covering of the path leading to it during divine illumination. Section 8. The image of the ox denotes the strong and the mature turning up the intellectual furrows for the reception of the heavenly and productive showers, and the horns, the guarding and indomitable. The representation of the eagle denotes the kingly and soaring and swift in flight and quickness in search of nourishment, which makes strong in wanness and agility and cleverness and unimpeded, straight and unflinching gaze toward the bounteous and brilliant splendor of the divine rays of the sun, which the robust extension of the visual powers. That of horses represents obedience and docility, and of those who are white, brilliancy and especially congenial to the divine light. But those who are dark blue, the hidden, and of those red, the fiery and vigorous, and of the piebald, the uniting of the extremes by the power passing through them and joining the first to the second and the second to the first, reciprocally and considerately. Now, if we did not consult the proportion of our discourse, we might not inappropriately adapt the particular characteristics of the aforesaid living creatures and their bodily representations to the heavenly powers, upon the principle of dissimilar similitude, for instance, their appearance of anger to intellectual manliness, of which anger is the remotest echo, and their desire to divine love, and to speak summarily, referring all the sensible perceptions and many parts of irrational beings to the immaterial conceptions and unified power of the heavenly beings. Now, not only is this sufficient for the wise, but even an explanation of one of the dissimilar representations would be sufficient for the accurate description of similar things after the same fashion. Section 9. But we must examine the fact that rivers are spoken of and wheels and chariots attached to the heavenly beings. The rivers of fire signify the supremely divine streams, furnishing to them an ungrudging and incessant flow and nourishing the productive powers of life. The chariots, the conjoined communion of those of the same rank, and the wheels being winged and advancing without turning and without deviation, the powers of their advancing energies within a straight and direct path toward the same unflinching straight swoop of their intellectual tract, supermundanely straight and direct way. Also, it is possible to explain, after another mystical meaning, the sacred description of the intellectual wheels, for the name Gel is given to them, as the theologian says. This shows, according to the Hebrew tongue, revolutions and revelations. For the Empyrean and godlike wheels have revolutions, indeed, by their perpetual motion around the good itself, but revelations by the manifestation of things hidden, and by the elevation of things at our feet, and by the descending procession of the sublime illuminations to things below. There remains, for accurate explanation, the statement respecting the rejoicing of the heavenly orders, for they are utterly incapable of our impassioned pleasure. For now they are said to rejoice with God over the discovery of what was lost, as befits their divine good nature, and that godlike and ungrudging rejoicing over the care and salvation of those who are turned to God, and that beyond description, of which also holy men also partake, whilst the deifying illuminations of the deity rests upon them. Let it suffice then to have said this much concerning the divine representations, which no doubt fall short of their accurate explanation, but which will prevent us, I think, from being servilely entangled in the resemblance of the types. But if you should say that we have not mentioned in the whole angelic powers or operations or likeness depicted in the oracles, we answer in truth that we do not possess the supramundane science of some, and further, in regard to them, we have not another to conduct, to light, and to reveal. Other things, however, as being parallel to the things said, we have omitted, out of regard to the symmetry of the discourse, and the hiddenness beyond our capacity we have honored by silence. So that was the on the heavenly hierarchies by Pseudo-Dionysius. Thank you for being present with the reading. I would love to just offer a few reflections and contemplations. I feel actually in the reading there is prompting of angelics in my field, and so that's why I am speaking about it. That's why I'm doing this work, actually, is they had a sort of, there's a sort of vibratory quality to the interactions with angels, as has been revealed to me through the work of the Book of Galactic Light, this ritual communication. and there's a kind of a quality to them that they're present, and they're insistent in specific ways. And there's a few things they would like me to point out. One is the gift of light. They would say to me that they have provided a great gift of light to us, and in this work we can see through the On Heavenly Hierarchies work, we can see how this might be understood and what this invites us to do, right? So we understand through contemplating the heavenly hierarchies that there is this sort of source experience, right? And actually, let's unpack this further, because there's like the one, there's the all, there's this realm of forms that we're understanding. This is the highest order, this is the hidden, right? And so then it kind of emanates this sense of spirit all the way down through the hierarchies to matter, right? And then this is the integral experience. It comes back from matter and recognizes itself. And that's really what's happening with these hierarchies being established in the celestial spheres, the heavenly spheres. And then in terms of the practice of Pseudo-Dionysius, it seems he is establishing these hierarchies here and now. One thing that's really important to understand in this context of this reading, right? We spent a lot of time understanding, did Seraphim actually talk to the prophet Isaiah? That seems rather ridiculous that seraphims, right? This is the argument, that seraphims would talk to Isaiah. Wouldn't it be actually one of the lower orders that are in charge of interacting with humans? And so Pseudo-Dionysius says, hey, yeah, actually, there was a communication by an angel to Isaiah regarding this sort of fiery nature. And by way of that link, the analogy, the fiery, the similitudes, right? He's talking about that there's a sense of embodiment of this of the fiery nature of the seraphim, and by that way, by this chain of beings, we can see a sense of identity from the higher to the lower, and so that we may even understand that the image of the thing carries the essence of it, and it is an invitation to go upward. And so we have this experience when we look to the kind of Platonic discourse about the nature of particular things versus their form, right? We contemplate that, hey, in this world, there's one side of a proportion. On the other side of that proportion is the world of forms. So when we see the sun in our world giving light and love and nourishment and warmth, that is like a one thing, right? We may understand that there's the good, right? The good, the beautiful, the just, which is Plato's word for it, but that is actually something divine, and that we can encounter it. And so this work shows that we can access, right, that all of this stuff is already happening in the one. It is already happening in the one, and we're just tuning our minds to it. That's what I would say is happening, but that we are invited to receive more of that energy through as much of our capacity as is possible, as much as lawful, in the words of Pseudo-Dionysius. We receive that in, and we can minister to those beneath us in this hierarchy, right? So in that way, right, we might even understand that we as human beings exist within a hierarchy of how these things unfold. So we're guided to take action, we take action, and we guide others. And I would say, actually, when we look to how the indigenous populations sometimes manage the ecology versus how the colonistic kind of exploitative cultures manage ecology, we might see there's a disconnect, right? We don't see ourselves in this hierarchy, which is actually sort of holographically encoded. Everything above is holographically encoded in that which is below. So the power of this text, actually, the power of this text is the invitation to follow this chain of being from here, like our experiences of, seeing angels represented by ox or whatever we go. The ox is really strong, therefore God is strong, right? We have to use our minds. We have to use our contemplative faculties to go there, right? So that's one practice that was talked about here. The other practice that was really talked about that I want to call out is the sense of oracle. Right? So the sense of oracle, there are two things happening here in this text. One is a reference to oracle. And then the other thing is this really kind of almost linguistic, conceptual discourse about the nature of things. And it's really applying this heavily rational mysticism to those experiences. And yet there is something like the oracle, it reveals the machinations of the higher celestial orders to the world of men. I don't know actually what the oracle is in this case. I find it rather interesting that it's really present, that it talks as if it does reveal knowledge and it does communicate through these sort of symbolic forms. There is a sense to it, something like dream, right? So the discourse that we had about the angelic forms coming from the oracle is the same kind of discourse we might have about angelic forms in our dreams, right? So we might go like, what does it mean? It came in the form of a horse, but also fiery wheels, right? What do these things mean? And we play around with association, and we get to a deeper truth that isn't actually representable in this sphere. These things are hidden. These things are energies. There's a bunch of stuff going on. And that's really what my experience was in working with the angels, right? They provided a sense of light. They gave me a gift, the Book of Galactic Light, that I'm giving out to you, sort of thing. So it's also, I would say in this case, very particularly in my case in working with the angelics, there is a strong and emphatic invitation that you relate to it, right? I don't need to, nobody else needs to baby bird feed you these things. That's what this sort of hierarchy that Pseudo-Dionysius was describing was like, all the way from God through the seraphs and cherubim, all the way through the angels, all the way through the hierarchs, these theological leaders in the community, all the way to the practitioner or whatever, this sort of baby birding. They consume light and they spit it out. And the people downstream do that. The invitation here is of course radiate light, of course radiate your connection, of course tune into that. But the invitation here is to go directly to source, right? The invitation here is go directly to the angels. Do not use an intermediary. That's what they're saying through me. That's what they're talking. I mean, you're relating to me in some way that you've found meaningful to you. If you've watched this video, or if even you're watching this reflection, you found the work I do with, like, say, the Book of Galactic Light to be meaningful, right? You see there is a connection there. And I am saying, hey, there is a connection. I'm sharing this. I'm trying to radiate this knowledge and wisdom as much as I can. But I really want that to wake you up to the notion that you yourself are God. That's it. That you yourself are in some way, shape, or form expressed through this hierarchy of angels and coming back to this sense of identity, right? So in that way, you don't need necessarily to tune in with my work. That's it. It's like, let's tune in together, right? Let's be different points along this circle where there's a center dot, right? Let's just be different points, and we can relate differently. We can talk to each other, whatever. We can inspire each other. That's super beautiful. But just letting you know that you can actually truly tune in to this hierarchy, and you can do that just by paying attention to what you experience, right? The light of the sun is a sufficient connection with this divinity. It's sufficient. It provides enough analogy. It provides enough understanding. It provides enough revelation of this whole chain all the way back, because it is actually and truly holographically encoded. It is a fractal experience. That's what he's saying. That's why it's a threefold division of three things, right? So there's a sense of nesting, fractalization. And so in that way, any single moment can wake you up to your own divine nature. Any single experience of light and love can communicate directly from the source to wherever you're at in your experience. And I would say that's the invitation here being offered. Thank you so much for being present. Thank you so much for doing this work of tuning in to the knowledge and wisdom that has gone before us, right? This is super important that we actually acknowledge our history in terms of humanity, in terms of our relationship with actual and true beings, with our true relationship to creation, with source, whatever words you want to use. It sounds ridiculous sometimes to some people to talk about angels in this materialist culture, and yet it's there. And yet you can have experience, and yet they're inviting you. And yet there's this rich history of discourse and dialogue between humanity and angels and celestial realms that we really, I would say, as a culture, need to bring to the forefront here as we are entering into celestial communication through our rocket ships, but also through our psychic connections with the galactic ambassadors surrounding us, right? So it's really important work. Thank you so much. And may you just consume or receive as much light as you need so that you can radiate it in joyfulness, creativity, play, fun, love, whatever, right? So once again, thank you.